most people believe they know who Helen Keller was. A deaf-blind girl in Alabama who could not communicate until a teacher held her hand under a water pump and spelled a word into her palm. An inspirational story about disability. A children's book. A lesson plan. A name everyone recognizes and almost no one truly knows. What most people have never been told is where she came from. Her father was a captain in the Confederate Army. Her family owned enslaved human beings. The home where she learned to spell that famous word was a plantation. And the woman who grew up inside that lineage spent her adult life trying to dismantle everything it stood for, until America, unable to reconcile the miracle with the radical, decided to remember one and bury the other. Before we go further, comment where you are watching from. And if this is your first time here, subscribe. Stories like this one deserve to be heard. Helen Adams Keller was born on June 27, 1880 in Tuscumbia, Alabama, on a family estate called Ivy Green. The house had wide porches. The grounds had gardens and cottages and the particular stillness that belongs to properties built for people who did not do their own labor. It was a home designed for comfort, and the comfort it provided rested on a foundation the family had never been required to question. Her father was Captain Arthur H. Keller. He had served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, and after the war ended, he became the editor of a local newspaper, the North Alabamian. He was a man of standing in his community, which in northwestern Alabama in the late 19th century meant a white man with land, connections, and the memory of a cause he had fought for and lost. Her mother, Kate Adams, came from a family with its own roots in the antebellum South, a family that occupied the same social position and carried the same unexamined assumptions about who that position was built to serve. The Keller name itself traces back to Swiss-German origins. Somewhere in the family's past, ancestors had left Europe and crossed the Atlantic, arriving in a country that was still deciding what it would become. Within a generation or two, those immigrants had become part of the Southern planter class, a class defined not only by land and status, but by its dependence on the institution of slavery. They had come from elsewhere and settled into a system, and the system had made them comfortable, and the comfort had made the system invisible. That is the family Helen Keller was born into, not the version most people carry, not the miracle story, the actual family. Confederate, slaveholding, Southern in the specific sense that the word carried before it was softened into an accent and a hospitality myth. At 19 months old, she was struck by an illness, likely scarlet fever or meningitis, though the records are not precise enough to say with certainty, and she lost both her sight and her hearing. The world as she had known it for less than 2 years closed shut. What followed were years of isolation, frustration, and a darkness that was not metaphorical. She could not see, she could not hear, and no one around her knew how to reach her. In March of 1887, Anne Sullivan arrived at Ivy Green. What happened next is the part of the story America chose to keep. The water pump, the word spelled into a small hand, the breakthrough, the miracle. It is a powerful story. It is also, in the way America tells it, a convenient one. Because the version that begins and ends at the water pump leaves out nearly everything that matters about who Helen Keller actually was and what she actually did with the mind the world had just celebrated as extraordinary. That omission is not an accident of time or a natural consequence of a long life fading from public memory. It is a deliberate editorial choice, made by a culture that found one version of Helen Keller useful and another version threatening. And the wall it built between the two is the reason most people alive today can name her and describe her childhood and have no idea whatsoever what she believed, what she fought for, or what she wrote. The wall that stands between the public and the full story of Helen Keller is not made of missing records. Every document exists. Every book she wrote is published. Every essay is archived. Every speech was reported on at the time it was given. The genealogical record of her family is available to anyone who looks. Her father's Confederate service is documented. The slaveholding history of the Keller family is a matter of property records and census schedules. Her political affiliations, her organizational memberships, her public statements on race and class and power, all of it sits in libraries and archives, undestroyed and unclassified. The wall is not absence. The wall is selection. America chose which parts of Helen Keller to teach and which parts to leave in the archive. It kept the disability. It kept the breakthrough. It kept the water pump. It discarded the socialism. It discarded the labor activism. It discarded the racial justice advocacy. It discarded the anti-war positions. It discarded the woman who used the very platform the miracle story had given her to say things the country did not want to hear. That kind of erasure does not require a shredder or a locked vault. It requires only a curriculum, a children's book that ends in the right place, a movie that frames the story correctly, a cultural consensus, arrived at without discussion, that certain lives are best remembered in partial form. The result is a version of Helen Keller that is familiar to virtually every American and bears almost no resemblance to the woman who actually lived. The inspirational story is not false. It is simply incomplete in ways that change its meaning entirely. And that is the wall. Not built from missing information, but from the decision to stop reading at a certain page and call the story finished. If you think stories like these matter, if you believe that the histories we choose to forget deserve to be spoken as clearly as the ones we choose to remember, a like goes further than you might think. It tells the algorithm this is worth showing to someone else. What dismantles this particular wall is not a DNA test. Helen Keller died in 1968, decades before genetic ancestry testing existed. Her ashes rest at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. There is no genome to sequence, no haplogroup to trace, no autosomal percentage to calculate. What dismantles this wall is simpler and, in some ways, more damning. It is the documentary record itself, the genealogical evidence, the public archives, and above all, her own published words. The tool capable of breaking through is not technology. It is the willingness to read what has always been available and to follow where it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. The genealogical record of the Keller family establishes what the inspirational narrative never mentions. Captain Arthur H. Keller served the Confederacy. He fought in a war waged to preserve the institution of slavery. He returned to a community that had depended on enslaved labor for its economic existence, and he raised his family in a home that had been built within that economy. Ivy Green was not a cottage. It was a plantation. The land it sat on had been worked by enslaved people. The structures that surrounded the main house included quarters where human beings lived in bondage. The property records and census schedules from antebellum Colbert County confirm what the landscape itself would have made obvious to anyone standing on it before 1865. The Keller family's position in Alabama society was inseparable from the institution that made that position possible. The home where Helen Keller learned to spell the word water was a home where people had been held as property. The hands that guided her toward language belonged to Anne Sullivan. The land beneath her feet had been cleared, planted, and maintained by people whose names the family's records did not always bother to preserve. That is the first layer. The origin, the soil. The roots go further back. The Keller name traces to Switzerland, to German-speaking regions that fed a stream of emigration toward the American colonies in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Those ancestors arrived as outsiders, as foreigners navigating a new country with a new language and an unfamiliar social order. And within a remarkably short span, they ceased to be outsiders. They became insiders. They became landowners. They became slaveholders. They became part of the very system that had not existed in the country they left behind. That trajectory, from immigrant to oppressor within a generation, is not unique to the Kellers. It is one of the recurring patterns of American history, repeated across ethnicities and centuries. People arrived with nothing, were offered a place in the hierarchy, and accepted it without examining what the hierarchy was built on. The Kellers' Swiss-German origins make them no different from dozens of other immigrant families who traded their foreignness for a seat at a table they did not build and whose construction they chose not to investigate. What makes Helen Keller different is what she did when she finally understood the table. We tell stories like this every week. Ancestry, identity, the hidden histories behind public faces. If you do not want to miss the next one, subscribe and turn on notifications. But right now, there is one more layer to this story, and it is the one America tried hardest to forget. In 1909, Helen Keller joined the Socialist Party of America. She did not join quietly. She did not attach her name to a membership roll and leave it at that. She wrote about it. She spoke about it. She published an essay titled "How I Became a Socialist," and laid out her reasoning with the same clarity and precision that the world had admired when it was directed at less threatening subjects. She supported the industrial workers of the world, one of the most radical labor organizations in the country. She advocated for women's suffrage at a time when the movement was treated as a disruption rather than a correction. She spoke in favor of birth control. She opposed the entry of the United States into the First World War. She raised money for the NAACP and spoke publicly against lynching and racial segregation in the American South, the same South her father had fought to preserve. She did not do these things in spite of understanding her family's history. She did them because she understood it. Her own writings make the connection explicit. She drew a direct line between the oppression she experienced as a disabled woman and the oppression faced by workers, by Black Americans, by anyone the system had designated as less than fully human. She recognized that the structures that had excluded her were the same structures that had enslaved the people who worked her family's land, and she said so, in print, under her own name, repeatedly, for decades. The response was instructive. When Helen Keller was an inspiration, a deaf-blind woman who had overcome impossible odds, the press celebrated her as a genius. Her mind was miraculous. Her achievements were proof of the human spirit's capacity to triumph over adversity. She was America's most beloved symbol of resilience. When she became a socialist, the same press questioned whether her disabilities made her susceptible to manipulation. The same mind that had been called miraculous was suddenly called naive. The same woman who had been trusted to represent the best of the American spirit was suddenly deemed unqualified to hold political opinions. Not because her reasoning was flawed, because her conclusions were inconvenient. That shift reveals something the genealogical record alone cannot. It reveals the terms of the bargain America had offered Helen Keller, without ever stating them aloud. She was permitted to be extraordinary, as long as her extraordinary qualities were directed inward, toward personal triumph, toward overcoming her own limitations, toward a story that asked nothing of anyone else. At the moment she directed those same qualities outward, toward the systems that produced suffering, toward the economy that depended on exploitation, toward the racial hierarchy her own family had helped enforce. The permission was revoked. They did not silence her. They did something more effective. They stopped listening. And then, slowly, over decades, they stopped teaching. The curriculum kept the water pump. The books kept the miracle. The woman who had spent more of her life as a political radical than she had ever spent as a symbol of disability, perseverance, was reduced, by careful omission, to the second version only. Helen Keller lived to be 87 years old. She was a Socialist Party member for decades. She published 12 books and hundreds of essays. She traveled the world advocating for the blind, the deaf, the poor, and the dispossessed. She did not soften her positions with age. She did not retract her politics. She did not apologize for the conclusions her mind had reached. What she said, in her own words, about the relationship between her disability and her politics is worth hearing in its original register. She did not describe her activism as separate from her experience of blindness and deafness. She described it as inseparable from it. The systems that failed to educate disabled children were the same systems that failed to protect workers. The ideology that treated certain lives as less valuable than others did not stop at the boundaries of any single category. It flowed through all of them. She saw the architecture, and she said what she saw. That is the finding America buried. Not a genetic result, not a distant ancestor traced through mitochondrial DNA, something far closer and far more uncomfortable. A woman born into the Confederacy's afterlife, raised on a plantation, handed a name and a lineage that pointed in one direction, who chose, with full awareness and unflinching deliberation, to walk in the opposite direction, and a country that could not tolerate the contradiction, so it resolved it the only way it knew how, by forgetting half of it. That tension between the ancestor we are given and the person we decide to become is the question at the center of every story we tell on this channel. But Helen Keller's version of it cuts differently than most. I am curious what you think. When a person rejects everything their lineage stood for, is that a betrayal of ancestry or the highest possible use of it? Tell me in the comments. The genealogical record of Helen Keller is complete in ways that most ancestral stories are not. There are no missing documents. There are no erased names. The Confederate service is filed. The property records are archived. The slaveholding is documented in the same census schedules that failed to record the names of the people who were held. The Swiss-German origins of the Keller name are traceable across continents and centuries. The political writings are published, cataloged, and available to anyone who asks for them. Nothing was destroyed. Everything was simply set aside, placed behind the version of Helen Keller that a nation found easier to carry. The girl at the water pump. The miracle of language. The triumph over darkness and silence. A story with no politics, no ancestry, no reckoning, and no cost. The real story has all four. A family that crossed an ocean and joined a system. A father who fought a war to defend it. A daughter who lost her sight and her hearing before she was 2 years old and spent the next 85 years seeing and hearing more clearly than most of the people who had been granted both. A woman who looked at the name she had been given and the lineage it represented and chose, not to disown it, but to answer for it, in ways no one in her family had ever considered necessary. The ancestry is documented. The rebellion is documented. The erasure is documented. The only thing missing from the record is an honest explanation for why a country that celebrates courage in the abstract found this particular version of it so difficult to remember. The bloodline ran toward the Confederacy. The woman ran the other way. America kept the water pump and buried the direction she chose to walk. If this stayed with you, I want to hear from you. Whose ancestry should we explore next? Drop a name in the comments, a person whose roots you have always been curious about. The next story might start with your suggestion. I will see you in the next one.